seen. Whoa, that must be 100 years old.
A 100 years. Century upon century. The history of Pennsylvania forests is a history of choices. The Native Americans and French fur trappers chose to coexist with the forest. Inhabitants of the English colonies who became Americans demanded control of the land for their own economic gain, initially for farming, but later characterized by the massive harvesting of the forest in the late 1800s. In the early 1900s, key individuals chose to begin a process of conservation of both land and wildlife. Over the years, some states and the federal government designated tracts of forest land to remain forever wild, allowing a natural cycle of growth, climax, and rebirth to occur. Others, including Pennsylvania, have adopted a multiple-use philosophy that guided the choices we have made in the management of our state-owned timberland. All of these choices have served to shape America's forests. The borders of Pennsylvania encompass 28 million acres of land. Cities, towns, roads, and waterways make up 5.5 million acres, but nearly 60% of Pennsylvania, or 17 million acres, is forest land. Of those 17 million acres, almost 4 million are publicly owned. However, over 12 million acres are under private ownership. Perhaps you own some of that forest land, or maybe you know someone who does. What choices will we make today that will affect Pennsylvania's forests tomorrow? In post-Ice Age Pennsylvania, over 12,000 years ago, Native Americans hunted for moose, elk, and deer in forests of chestnut, white pine, hickory, hemlock, and oak. These early Americans lived on the land with little noticeable change to their surroundings. During the centuries prior to the arrival of the European settlers, generation after generation of the Susquehannock, Delaware, and Iroquois tribes enjoyed the benefits of the forest throughout Pennsylvania. When the first English colonists arrived in the 1600s, they imposed an agrarian philosophy on the land. The forest was perceived as an obstacle to be overcome if farming was to succeed. Initially, while some timber was used to build log buildings and barns, much of it was just piled and burned. In this manner, the land was cleared for farming. Following the end of the Civil War in 1865, a lumber industry emerged that took advantage of Pennsylvania's rich timber resource. One of the first industrial uses of the forest was to supply charcoal for the iron industry. Each iron furnace required the daily harvesting of up to an acre of hardwood trees to provide charcoal for the furnace. It is estimated from the 1700s to the 1900s, 3 to 3.5 million acres were repeatedly cut to produce charcoal for the iron industry. Sawmills were an essential element in producing lumber for market. The first sawmill used a water wheel to power a vertically mounted saw blade. These early mills were usually combined with a grist mill. By 1820, steam-driven gang saws, circular saws, and eventually band saws were invented and further accelerated the sawing process. The eastern white pine, over 100 feet in height, was plentiful in Penn's woods. Until the late 1800s, these majestic trees were in great demand by the shipbuilding industry for mainmasts, booms, yards, bowsprits, and decking. At first, rivers were the highways that carried logs and lumber to the sawmills, and rafts were the vehicles of choice. During the mid to late 1800s, log booms and log driving came into use, and the rafting era gradually came to a close. By 1851, James Perkins, John Dubois, and several other businessmen who formed the Susquehanna Boom Company in Williamsport had finished construction of the Susquehanna boom. The boom consisted of a series of rock-filled cribs placed in the river. The cribs were connected by chained timbers and formed a gigantic pocket to catch the free-floating logs. The Williamsport boom could hold 300 million board feet of logs in any one year. It gave rise to over 30 sawmills that in turn supported dozens of woodworking shops. This made Williamsport one of the major lumber-producing centers on the East Coast. The boom operated until 1909, when the last logs were floated downriver. In the early days of rafting and log driving, logging was limited to areas close to rivers and streams. It was too expensive to transport logs from remote areas to sawmills. By 1864, a new technology was introduced that would change all that: the logging railroad. Loggers could now easily harvest trees from the mountain regions of Pennsylvania. Steam-powered log loaders developed during this time greatly accelerated removal of timber from the woods. Initially, hemlock was not logged for the lumber, but for its bark that was high in tannic acid used in processing leather. When other timber became scarce, hemlock achieved importance as a construction lumber. As the lumber industry spread into the hemlock forests of the northern tier counties, logging camps were hastily constructed to house the wood hicks, as Pennsylvania loggers were called. When logging operations moved on, the camp was quickly dismantled and reassembled at the site of the new logging operations. Towns sprang up, seemingly overnight, near the sawmills. Towns like Cross Fork in southern Potter County, with a population of 2,000, had 7 hotels, 5 grocery stores, 4 churches, and a YMCA. When the timber had been cut, many towns disappeared almost as fast as they had appeared. By 1920, with the forest resource largely depleted, the lumber industry moved into West Virginia and the Lake States, leaving an ecological disaster in its wake. As a result, key individuals emerged who championed forest conservation. They preached a new philosophy of management, mainly derived from German forestry practices. As early as 1792, prompted by harmful deforestation of their own countries, both Germany and France had developed effective guidelines and management plans for proper conservation of their forests. In 1895, Dr. Joseph Rothrock, an early forestry advocate, became Pennsylvania's first forestry commissioner. Rothrock is regarded as the father of forestry in Pennsylvania. Myra Lloyd Dock was appointed to the State Forest Reservation Commission in 1901, making her the first woman to secure a government post in Pennsylvania. In the early 1900s, Gifford Pinchot served as Chief Forester of the U.S. Division of Forestry, later to become the U.S. Forest Service. He secured 200 million acres of forest lands that became the National Forest System. The first American trained in forestry, he established policies that still guide state and national foresters today. Founded in 1903 by Dr. Rothrock, the Pennsylvania State Forest Academy at Mount Alto in Franklin County trained the state's rangers and foresters, who had the monumental job of suppressing wildfires and reforesting the land. Mount Alto graduates had to work in the state's forestry service for at least 3 years, and many made lifelong careers as state foresters. Originally established in 1901 as the Pennsylvania Department of Forestry, the department is now known as the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Bureau of Forestry. Today, the Bureau manages 2.1 million acres of public forest. Initially, softwood forests dominated the Pennsylvania landscape. Today, however, 60% of Pennsylvania is covered with one of the most valuable hardwood forests to grow anywhere in the world. With a worldwide market for a variety of products, Pennsylvania's hardwood forests are once again an important economic asset. The forests of the northeastern United States and the Lake States were the first to be harvested, and they were the first states to determine how to deal with reforestation and management. Today, Pennsylvania's public forests are sustainably managed for recreation, aesthetics, watershed protection, wildlife habitat, and commerce. Pennsylvania's forests, our heritage, are the result of choices made over the past 4 centuries. Some choices have proved to be well-founded, others short-sighted. What choices will be made to shape the forests of tomorrow? The choice is ours.